Hello, hello. Welcome to our next episode of No Lids, No Limits podcast. I've got a very special guest today with us, Kaitlyn Tredaway. So, Kaitlyn, a little introduction about yourself.
Thanks so much, Ken. Really, thanks for having me. First of all, really excited to be here. For those of you who maybe don't know me, my name is Kaitlyn. As Ken mentioned, I am a part of the leadership team at CalcuQuote. We are a software as a service. We work with contract manufacturers in the electronics space, very much focused on transforming how electronics manufacturers do quoting, any type of their supply chain processes. And at CalcuQuote, I get to sit right at the intersection of technology and supply chain and customer experience. And that I think gives me a really good front row seat to where the industry is heading, which is really exciting and what's holding it back. So I'm really looking forward to diving into the conversation with Ken today on what's going on in the industry and challenges and opportunities.
Thank you for that introduction, Kaitlyn. Again, I'm Kin. I'm from Canada, 30 years of manufacturing operations experience. I was actually Kaitlyn's customer at one point. This is how we came across each
Small
other and met
world.
each other. Yeah, and CalcuQuote was a very transformational way that changed two of my clients that I have been working with. And so
Yeah,
I'm so glad to have you, Kaitlyn, as a guest on our podcast today. Kaitlyn, in my
thank you.
experience working as the EMSs and even with the OEMs, getting a quotation is always a bit challenging because there's always this dimension of I need a really fast quote or I need a super accurate quote. And I've lived both of those dimensions before. I'm interested to
Mhm.
hear about your insight on what is more important when it comes to an EMS. Is it faster or is it cheaper? I guess more accurate quote that matters.
I've been with CalcuQuote almost 10 years now and have worked with over 500 different contract manufacturers on a global basis. And I think everybody would maybe tell you a little bit something differently, but it also depends on the market that they're in, the customers that they service, the location that they're working through, the types of quotes that they're working on. As everybody knows, it's not the same across the board. However, I would say that price is not necessarily the most important, but turn time isn't also the most important. They're both just as important to each other. And the reason I say that speed has become a huge part of the value proposition for a contract manufacturer to an OEM. No doubt, we live in a world where you can order a toothbrush online at midnight and have it to your house the next morning if you've forgotten it, right? And so we're all in that mentality that we really want something now and fast and quick, but we also don't want to go down in quality. We want to make sure that the quality is still there. So when an OEM sends a request for quote, an RFQ to a contract manufacturer, they're not just comparing you to the EMS next door. I'm sure you've had this experience in your EMS pastime. They're comparing you to the experience of what they know as something quick and fast. And that's not just the businesses that they work with, that's just their experience in life. So the truth is that speed doesn't replace the price, but it does say a lot about the business and it says a lot about how you're going to work together as a partner. So a fast and accurate quote is, can be a signal to say, well, I'm organized. You have your house in order. You have your data under control. You're going to be a reliable partner. You're going to get me something that is going to be not just fast, but also reliable. And so we always tell customers the first quote is often going to set the stage for the whole conversation and anchor that conversation with your customer moving forward. So you can have the best price in the world, but if you are 3 weeks late, likely that customer has already gone with somebody, even if it is $100 more per board, because that shows them something, because it shows them within a deadline that the OEM gave them. So to answer your original question, I would say that time isn't more important than price, but it is just as important as price.
That's a very good perspective and very insightful there. Thank you, Kaitlyn. I mean, to share some of my own experience as well as an EMS, we're often challenged with putting out probably 20, 30, 40 quotes, maybe to win one. And, the amount of time spent for in a quotation, for the quotation team, by the procurement team, by the engineering team to put together that quote is one dimension that we've always been looking at in terms of, well, how do we save some of that effort? If we're going to be winning maybe that 1 in 20 or 1 in 40 or God forbid 1 in 100, that's a
Exactly.
lot of quotes that are done that we're never going to get paid for.
Time is money, as we all know. And from an EMS perspective, I say this all the time. Margins are small. It's a small margin business. So you have to make sure you can become efficient in the ways that are going to save you money, but also give your customers a really good experience. I have some customers in the past who say, well, every single time we get a quote, we load that into our ERP system and create customer part numbers and internal part numbers. And they say, well, are you sure you're going to win all of those? You're wasting so much time to do that. And getting that extra data and manual data entry, it's like, well, focus the time on the value add that you can do. Go out and using something like CalcuQuote or a similar application, source 80% of your parts, get an estimation on what the labor is going to cost, understand your overhead, and go out and do that very quickly so that you can put your person who is really skilled and focus on the 20% of the quote that might be the differentiator and just automate the rest of it. Not only is that going to help your OEM, but it's also going to help your team internally not do mindless work that is really not adding any value.
Very true. My experience working with CalcuQuote was it was a very easy way for not just the quotation team, but also the
Yeah,
procurement team in being able to tap into some real-time data. I use the analogy that component pricing is very much like the stock market. You never know what's going to happen to it the next
exactly.
minute. How does CalcuQuote utilize APIs to really make that process much more seamless?
We work with different partners in the industry from if we're talking APIs and you're thinking about instant pricing, instant stock information, just information around parts, vendors like DigiKey, Mauser, TTI, TI, so on and so forth, Avnet, Arrows of the world. We utilize those integrations and we like to consider ourselves a vehicle of data. We are not owning data for any type of customer. We are not going to be the source of the information, but we are going to be the vehicle of delivery. So, as an example, the way I like to tell this to customers is you're going to use CalcuQuote, but you're going to connect your specific API with all of your vendors to get your contracted pricing for real time information. The benefit of that is you don't have to then send out a request for quote to your vendors and say, hey, for this cap that is probably a penny part, can you tell me how much it's going to cost and how long when I can get it? That's not value add to you or to your supplier. That's instant information that you can get. So with CalcuQuote, we've worked for the last 10 years with vendors to create integrations with their internal systems to take a manufacturer part number and a quantity and say, how much in the market is this going to cost me from, all of the vendors that I just listed, but not just the standard price. What's it going to cost for me as my company? I'm sure you've had this kin in your past where every EMS company likely has negotiated pricing with their vendors to say, well, that part may have been 5 cents, but I've negotiated because I buy a lot of them over the course of, a year, that it's going to be 3 cents. And you want that price to come into your quote application from a supply chain perspective. You don't want the 5 cent price because obviously we talked earlier, price is just as important as turn time in these cases. So those integrations with the vendors are really important. Not all of them are maybe as advanced as others, but we're moving in that direction as an industry.
How do you push more suppliers to get on board with the whole API integration idea? Because my experience a few years ago using CalcuQuote was
Yeah.
not all my suppliers are on that system.
So I think 10 years ago, I would say we had very small fraction of the suppliers that we have moving there today. A lot of it takes inviting and showing the demand of what's going on in the market. Suppliers are all at very different stages of digital maturity and where they can put their resources for their digital programs. Some have incredible APIs that they dedicate full teams to. Others are still running quotes on Excel or just through a mutual inbox. And our job and what we want to make sure is clear is we can work with whatever path works best for the customer and the supplier. And we want to make sure no matter what, we can help everybody be a digital path for that. We always push our customers. So when we had a customer come to us to say, hey, I'd love to have an API integrated with this vendor at CalcuQuote, we can speak for the masses, but a lot of the time it's helpful for the customer who's actually spending the money with that vendor to say, I think I could spend more with you if you made this easier for me. And that's actually a better path than pushing a vendor in a way to say, hey, just give us this data because they don't understand the vision. But if you can lay out what the vision is for suppliers, manufacturers, distributors in the electronic space to say, this customer that you do business with, imagine you can do more business with, you can do it faster, you can do it even better than you do it today. That's the reason for investing in an API, not just because this technology company, CalcuQuote's asking for it. So you really have to lay out the foundation. One of my favorite stories that I have is one of our suppliers, they're actually a manufacturer that we work with. They have a great API. Their API is great, but it didn't actually work for some of their customers. It worked fine for some, but for their larger customers, this doesn't work for them. So the customer went to them and say, "Hey, we need a different way to do this." So what we've done now is instead of a direct API with just pricing and stock information about the part, we said, "Okay, well, what if we allow the customer to still give all of that detailed information in what seems like a more manual request?" But instead of an API where we gather that data, we push the data into your internal systems. So it's not just using APIs in one way, it's using them in different ways and meeting the vendors where they are while also meeting the customer needs. Yeah.
I've always embraced this idea of being transparent and clear, and APIs is absolutely part of that. At this point in the industry, you mentioned about 10 years ago was only a fraction of the suppliers.
Yeah.
Are you seeing the trend now that majority of suppliers are already on board with API integration to get pricing more transparent and clear to customers?
Yeah, I would say most are leaning that way. We probably have about 80% of suppliers that customers would like from an API standpoint. Now, it's the maturity of their API that is the next stage of all of this. There's still some vendors in there, I won't name any names, that we would love to have API connections with, and our customers would love to have API connections with too. And the more we can gather a large set of customers and say, "Hey, we're all really pushing for this, and it's for the benefit of all of us," I think we'll move there. Those who have an API, though, there is still lots of room for improvement. So we've seen, everybody starts usually with the search API. It's just tell me with this manufacturer part number, tell me the cost and tell me the stock information. And that's as far as you go. The next iteration of that has become quote APIs. And so we have only a handful of vendors that are in the maturity of what a quote API is. And a quote API is going to actually give me a quote ID that says, "You're sending this part number to this vendor. Here's your ID." So I have that pricing locked in for that 30 days. And that's that visibility and that confirmation that customers really want so that they feel comfortable that a price that they got from the API is a price they can actually go purchase. And so the next stage of this will be quote APIs. After that will be order APIs. So most vendors are leaning towards an API, but now it's a decision of how much do we go into the API world and how much do we invest into that? You can then talk about registered pricing with an end OEM and how do you automate that? There's so much now that you can do with it when you open the door.
You've worked with a lot of EMS customers out there,
Yeah.
and you've probably seen all walks of life from the most advanced to some of the most simple operations.
Yeah.
What is your perspective on stepping into this world of AI hype and AI transformations? We talked about a lot in our past episodes. Where do you see manual processes being eliminated in EMS going forward? Whether it be in quoting or APIs, we just talked about that. What is your take, on this whole AI transformation, and which manual processes will likely be replaced?
I think there's one that always is going to be the first that comes to my head, and probably one that everybody would say, which is going to be bomb cleanups. Bombs come in 12,000 shapes and sizes, if not more. And you don't want your really technical value add people spending hours cleaning up bills of material, normalizing manufacturer part numbers, going to different websites to check a part, reformatting an Excel file. You want to allow AI or systems to be able to interpret that data. That's always going to be my initial gut reaction to this. I sit and think through this question because we get it asked a lot from our customers. I think there needs to be something around streamlining line cards and manufacturers and things within the industry that feel like they're ever changing. I'm sure you have this experience where somebody calls TI, somebody calls it Texas Instruments, somebody calls it Texas INT. And that is just, it makes the data really messy in this industry. And it's becoming something that should be normalized, but it's not normalized. And it causes a lot of hiccups. So if there's a way that we could take AI, and the CalcuQuote's working on a lot of exciting things around those situations where we can take AI or take data to be able to better understand bills of material from a cleanup perspective, but then also figuring out how we can help streamline those line cards. It would make everybody's life a little bit easier. And I think that could be a really interesting focus that I don't think everybody's doing right now.
One of my pet peeves, Caitlin, is when I get a bill of materials from a customer for quote, and the engineer has put in whether it be a question marks or asterisks or underscore in some of those
Right.
suffixes in the MPNs.
Yes.
My goodness, it is one of
It's horrible.
the pet peeves that I'm sure you guys come across. How does
Yeah.
your system handle that? Are you guys able to deal with these kind of cryptic or partial MPNs and still be able to get
Yeah.
an accurate quote?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done a lot of work. We call it Smart Bomb Import. Our AI team, our developers, to try to interpret every different type of bill of material that we've ever seen from a structural standpoint and say, how can we take that bill of material without touching it and throw it into the application and have it interpret it as close to accurate as possible, and then let customers then go source it. I always say, because this industry is so nuanced, that you want to trust that verify process. You want to, of course, trust that the data is correct, but as a human, and this is where a human's value comes into play, verify that information now that that's in the system. And we've been able to take incredibly complicated bills of material, and you're not talking just flat bills of material, you're talking multi-level bombs that are 4 or 5 different sub levels deep into it with PCBAs, with programmable parts, and say, well, without touching it, let's put it into the application and let the application interpret it. And not only is it going to take that bill of material and interpret it, but then it's going to use our different algorithms to say, well, you gave me this Molex part number that has no zero at the front and no dashes, but I know that that's the same part number as the Molex part number that every one of my vendors is returning. So I'm going to give you a match to that. And it's going to then go and say, well, you can actually just go source this part. Where in theory, in the past, if you didn't have all of that information, it would say, sorry, there's no match to it. Same thing with packaging differentiations. You know, there's a TR at the end, or a TU, or a CT, or a tape, or all the different endings, back to our no consistency in the industry sometimes, that the system's able to interpret it. And that just streamlines and makes people's lives so much easier to be able to actually go out and source and come back with a quote on time.
A lot of this knowledge about how to read these part numbers, I was trained by my predecessors who were long
Yeah.
retired, and we've developed these kind of tribal knowledge over the years of how to deal with particular customers that come up with very challenging bombs, very cryptic bombs, to understand cryptic even manufacturing instructions. Some of my colleagues, were talking about, what happens when Xers start to exit the workforce, taking some of that tribal knowledge away. Do you see how AI is really kind of stepping in to backfill some of that tribal knowledge? I mentioned about the smarts
Yeah.
and being able to interpret part numbers. What is your perspective on that?
It's so funny because I have met with so many different EMS customers in the past. And before I maybe talk about the AI piece, I think the thing that we first need to do is we need to make EMS seem cool again, right? Which sounds so funny and silly, but nobody thinks about going to college and then going into the EMS space. So you have people who have been in it for so long, which is amazing. But as you mentioned, you have people who are now moving out of it and moving into retirement, and you need new talent to come in. So I think the first thing that we have to do is figure out how do we get new talent into the space, because it's something that I'm actually pretty passionate about. I've been very interested and fascinated about what IPC is doing, and I think as a young individual who came into this space in my 20s, I like to see how people can actually move into this space even more, and that would be an incredible thing to see. And that plays into how do you get the tribal knowledge of all of the people who have been in this industry moving into helping the new generation get that information. I think AI definitely plays a role in accelerating learning. I don't think that you need to be able to look at a part number and tell you how much and exactly how often you buy that part. I don't think that's something that we need to spend our time on. What I think that we need to allow tribal knowledge to come is we need to say, okay, well, think through the rules based decision making that somebody like a sourcing manager does, or somebody that a purchasing manager or a plant manager. Think through the rules based decision making that they do. That's the tribal knowledge that you want to hand off. You don't want to hand off. I typically buy this on Monday afternoon at 2 p.m. because I know my rep is going to call me and they're going to offer me this lunch. So that's exactly what I'm doing. That's not the tribal knowledge you care about. You want your AI to tell you, and you want, AI to accelerate.
Yes, of course. Kaitlyn, we're stepping into 2026, which is very exciting. And if we were able to grant you one New Year's wish about what you want to see in 2026, what might that be? I absolutely support that. For myself as well, I truly believe that the industry does need a change. It's needed a change for many decades that I've seen. And I think that push is still there. I'm very passionate, like you, about helping to make that change. And we're hoping that this podcast is going to help some of the people looking into coming in the industry and the people that are in the industry and the people exiting to perpetuate this industry because without manufacturing, we don't have all the goodies that we have in everyday life that we need and we want. So I absolutely support that. Well, Caitlin, thank you very much for spending the time with us today on our podcast. And I really appreciate all your insight that you provided. And if anyone wants to get a hold of you, can they get connected with you through LinkedIn? Yeah. Okay. All right, and we'll drop a link to Caitlin's LinkedIn profile so everyone can connect. So, if anyone in the audience has any feedback or questions, again, feel free to drop a comment. Again, we want to hear from you. Until next time, thank you very much, and thank you very much again, Caitlin, for being part of this podcast.